In the last week of April 1945, while Berlin was being crushed under Soviet artillery, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany slipped into the north and asked a Swedish count to carry a message west. Not for mercy, not for peace in the full sense, for a separate surrender, a private deal, a last-minute bargain that might save part of the Reich while the rest of Europe burned. But whose offer was it really? Before this story unfolds, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because some truths from history stay hidden until someone speaks them out loud. By then, the Third Reich was no longer a machine of conquest. It was a wreck, still making orders. Berlin was being torn apart by Soviet guns. Hitler was underground. The Western Allies were deep inside Germany. Roads were packed with soldiers, prisoners, refugees, and officials trying to outrun the end. What had once looked cold, disciplined, and all-powerful was now showing its real face. Fear under pressure, power without a future, loyalty beginning to rot. The deeper force driving this story had been there from the start. Nazi rule had always depended on obedience to one man, and on a chain of command built on terror. Hitler ruled by absolute loyalty. Men rose by serving him, protecting him, and carrying out his will without hesitation. That system made the regime look solid for years. It also made it fragile in a way most dictatorships are fragile. Once defeat became undeniable, the same men who had built their power inside that system had to face a final question: die with it, or move before it buried them too. That poison was already spreading through the last months of the war. Into that dying world stepped Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden. He was not part of the Nazi state. He was a Swedish nobleman and vice president of the Swedish Red Cross. And in the final stretch of the war, he had something almost no outsider still had inside Germany: access. Bernadotte had become deeply involved in rescue work that would later be known around the world as the White Buses operation. Starting in March 1945, buses painted white and marked with red crosses moved into the collapsing Reich to pull prisoners out of camps and carry them towards safety. The operation began with the aim of rescuing Scandinavian prisoners, then widened and saved thousands more from many countries. It was humanitarian work, but in the last weeks of Nazi Germany, humanitarian work also meant negotiation, pressure, and contact with men whose hands were covered in blood. That is what gave Bernadotte his strange place in this story. He could move where diplomats could not. He could meet officials others could no longer reach. He could still be summoned. And in a collapsing regime, that kind of summons was never simple. Every request carried another layer. One conversation might save prisoners. Another might hide a political test. A promise could be real for 1 hour and worthless the next. Bernadotte had already dealt with Heinrich Himmler during the rescue effort because Himmler controlled the police empire, the concentration camp system, and the SS. He was one of the darkest men in Europe. And still, by spring 1945, he was someone Bernadotte had to deal with if lives were to be pulled out of the camps before the war ended. Himmler had spent years near the center of Hitler's world. He was loyal, methodical, feared, and deeply involved in the crimes of the regime. But by April 1945, even he could see what Hitler would not admit. Germany had lost. The question was no longer whether the Reich would survive. It was how the ending might be shaped, delayed, softened, or turned to the advantage of the men still standing near the top.
This is where the story begins to rise, because once Himmler accepted military defeat in his own mind, he began thinking beyond Hitler without saying so openly. He did not step out in public. He did not announce a break. He moved quietly through private channels, and one of those channels was Bernadotte. That choice says everything about the moment. A regime built on control was now leaning on a neutral humanitarian to carry messages through its ruins. Himmler did not reach for Bernadotte because he had changed morally. He reached for him because Bernadotte could still travel, still talk, and still be heard in the outside world. Around them, the war kept closing in. Camps were being evacuated. Fronts were disintegrating. Rumors moved faster than facts. German officials shifted northward as Berlin became a death trap. The old map of power was breaking apart, but Himmler was trying to sketch a new one before the paper burned up in his hands. The plan taking shape was never a true peace offer in the full sense, and that is one of the most important truths in this whole story. Himmler was not trying to end the war for everyone. He wanted a separate surrender in the West. He He hoped German forces could give themselves up to Britain and the United States while the fighting against the Soviet Union continued. Even after years of destruction, even with Berlin near its final hours, the Nazi leadership was still trying to split the Allied powers and turn one side against the other. Hidden inside that plan was another motive just as cold. If the West dealt with him, then Himmler might still present himself as useful. He might still survive politically. He might still matter after Hitler. That was the crack running beneath the whole scene. Hitler was alive. Hitler was still issuing orders. The Nazi state still demanded obedience. Yet one of the men who had helped build that state was already feeling for an exit in the dark. What made the moment so dangerous was not only the separate surrender idea, it was the betrayal inside it. A dictatorship can survive military setbacks longer than people expect. It has a much harder time surviving private disloyalty at the top, especially when that disloyalty comes from someone trusted for years. Himmler had spent much of the war as one of Hitler's most faithful servants. Now, in the last days, he was testing whether the world beyond Hitler might still make room for him. Bernadotte was stepping deeper into that reality, while still trying to save lives. That is part of what makes this story so heavy. He was not chasing a secret peace mission for glory. He was already moving through Germany because prisoners were still trapped and time was running out for them. The White Bus's mission had become one of the last large rescue efforts in a collapsing Europe. White-painted vehicles with red crosses on top were driving through a country that was breaking apart by the day.
Those buses were signs of mercy in a landscape shaped by organized cruelty. But the same access that made rescue possible also pulled Bernadotte toward the center of one of the Reich's final hidden political maneuvers. By mid to late April, northern Germany had the feel of an empire trying to leave its own body. Officials moved from one temporary center to another. Some still acted as if a miracle might save them. Others were already thinking about capture, escape, or surrender. Every road seemed to carry evidence of defeat. Every conversation had the sound of time running out. This was the world in which Bernadotte was urgently called north again. Himmler wanted to talk, and when a man like Himmler wanted to talk in April 1945, it meant the crisis had moved from the battlefield into the inner rooms of power. The rise of this story is not the rise of hope. It is the rise of a hidden gamble. Himmler was trying to get ahead of the ending. Bernadotte was being pulled into that attempt because he was one of the few men still able to cross between the collapsing Reich and the outside world. The rescue mission had opened the door. The desperation of the SS was now pushing something darker through it. And hanging over everything was the question that made the whole moment feel dangerous. Was Bernadotte about to carry Hitler's last secret peace offer, or was he about to uncover something even worse? Proof that the Nazi inner circle was beginning to split apart while Berlin still burned. He went north into that uncertainty, toward a meeting that would reveal just how far the collapse had already spread, and how close betrayal had come to the heart of Hitler's final days. On April 24, 1945, near Lübeck, the mask finally slipped. Himmler met Folke Bernadotte and made the offer plain. Germany would surrender to Britain and the United States, while the war against the Soviet Union would continue. That was the moment the whole story changed shape. Up to then, this secret channel still carried a thin layer of uncertainty. After that meeting, the truth was exposed. This was never a last attempt to stop the war everywhere. It was a last attempt to control the ruins. Himmler had looked at the map, looked at Berlin, looked at the Western Front, and decided that even in defeat, he might still divide his enemies and preserve part of Germany's fighting power for a different ending. Bernadotte understood how grave that was. He was dealing with a man who had helped build the SS terror system, a man tied directly to concentration camps, mass murder, and some of the worst crimes of the regime. Yet he also knew the war was still swallowing people by the hour. Prisoners were still trapped. Columns of refugees were still moving. Camps were still being emptied and shuffled as Nazi control broke down. In that kind of moment, refusing contact could close doors that still might save lives. So he carried the message forward, even while the message itself revealed something ugly at the center of the Reich's collapse.
Himmler's move was desperate, but it was not irrational in the narrow way desperate men think. He knew the Western Allies feared Soviet expansion. He knew the anti-Bolshevik obsession at the core of Nazi ideology had not died, even now. Somewhere in his collapsing view of the world, he still believed he could make himself useful. He could imagine saying, in effect, "Germany is finished in the West, but let us hold the East with you." It was fantasy, but it was the kind of fantasy that grows in the final hours of violent power. The men who create catastrophe rarely believe the end will come cleanly for them. They keep reaching for one more arrangement, one more exception, one more chance to stay relevant after everything else is gone. The answer from the Western side was always going to crush that plan. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had already bound themselves to the principle of unconditional surrender. There would be no private Western peace while German armies kept killing in the East. There would be no separate bargain with one of Hitler's closest men. Himmler's name alone poisoned any claim to legitimacy, and the political cost of such a deal would have been enormous. Bernadotte's channel carried the offer outward, but there was no real opening waiting at the other end. The proposal was refused. With that, the mission crossed into its darkest stage, because a secret move inside a dictatorship becomes far more dangerous once it fails. All of this was unfolding while Berlin was being smashed to pieces. Hitler was still in the Führer bunker. Communications were breaking down. The government still issued orders, but its grip was shrinking into a few rooms under a city that was dying above it. The closer the end came, the more personal everything became. There was no longer enough time, territory, or power to hide behind systems. Every decision now pointed directly at survival, loyalty, or betrayal. When word of Himmler's contact reached Hitler on the night of April 28 to 29, it hit him at the worst possible moment and in the worst possible way. This was not just news of a failed approach, this was proof that one of the men he had trusted most was already moving without him. Hitler had built his rule around loyalty and submission. He tolerated rivalries, encouraged competition, and often let his lieutenants overlap and clash. But one line could not be crossed. Nobody moved above him. Nobody prepared for a future beyond him while he still lived and ruled. Himmler had crossed that line.
He had not only approached the West, he had done it in a way that made it look as if he was already positioning himself for succession, as if Hitler's authority was now something that could be worked around. In a regime built on obedience, that was more than political disobedience, it was personal treason. Hitler reacted with fury, stripped Himmler of all his offices, and ordered his arrest. One of his last official acts was aimed not at the Red Army outside Berlin, but at the man who had helped build the police empire at his side. That reaction tells you how far the collapse had gone. Even as Berlin was being destroyed, the inner circle was still breaking itself apart. The military defeat was no longer the only story. The emotional collapse of Nazi power had become visible. The old image of hard unity, of a fanatically loyal command structure holding to the end, was giving way to something more pathetic and more revealing. Men who had enforced discipline across occupied Europe were now calculating, drifting, and trying to separate themselves from the wreckage. Himmler's move did not cause the fall of the Reich. The Reich was already falling, but it exposed the truth inside the fall. The regime was no longer dying as one body. It was splitting into frightened pieces. Bernadotte stood in the middle of that fracture, and that is what gives this chapter its weight. He was still moving through Germany under the flag of rescue. White-painted buses still carried prisoners away from camps. The mission still meant food, transport, and survival for people who had almost run out of time. Yet, at the same time, Bernadotte had been made the bearer of one of the last secret maneuvers of the Nazi elite. A humanitarian negotiator was now also the witness to a hidden betrayal at the top of Hitler's state. He could see both sides of the ending at once. On one side, people being pulled from death. On the other, powerful men still trying to bargain with history as if history might forget who they were. The cost of that contradiction is easy to miss if you look only at the diplomacy. The people packed into camps, prisons, roads, and ruined cities were not living inside these calculations as ideas. They were living inside them as danger. Every delay mattered. Every broken line of command mattered. Every false promise mattered.
Nazi officials still controlled prisoners, even while planning their own futures. Rescue operations still had to negotiate with men whose main instinct was survival, not mercy. Himmler's approach to Bernadotte did not soften the regime. It showed how selfish its final reflexes were. Even with Germany collapsing, even with tens of thousands of prisoners still in mortal danger, one of the most powerful men in the Reich was still focused on leverage. There is a reason this mission has drawn so much attention ever since. On the surface, it looks like the edge of an alternate history. People hear about a Swedish count, a secret offer, and the final week of Hitler's Germany, and they imagine a hidden peace that almost changed everything. The reality is harsher. By late April 1945, there was no real road left for the Reich to save itself through diplomacy. Himmler's proposal was already too late, too compromised, and too dishonest. It was not an opening into peace. It was a sign of panic.
The war machine was collapsing, and one of its chief architects was reaching for a deal that might spare his relevance, if not his honor, because honor had already vanished from this story long before. After Hitler's rage exploded in the bunker, Himmler's position changed almost instantly. The man who had commanded vast power now found himself cast out from the circle he had served for years. The timing made it even darker. Hitler was only days from death. Germany was only days from surrender. Himmler had gambled at the very edge of the abyss and lost. There would be no separate Western peace. There would be no role for him as the man who saved part of Germany. Instead, his move became one more sign that the Nazi state had begun consuming itself before the war had even fully ended. And still, none of this brought immediate relief to the people beneath it. The guns kept firing. Berlin kept dying. Prisoners kept waiting. Rescue convoys kept moving through a landscape that was both collapsing and still deadly. That is what makes this part of the story so painful. The men at the top were already acting out the aftershocks of defeat, but the people below them were still trapped inside the consequences. Bernadotte could carry messages, push for releases, and keep the White Bus's mission alive, but he could not stop the regime from disintegrating in the most dangerous way possible. He was watching a state fall apart while still having enough power to hurt people on its way down. By the end of those April days, the question from the beginning had become much sharper and much sadder. This was never Hitler reaching out for peace in some final moment of clarity. This was Himmler stepping out from under Hitler's shadow before the shadow disappeared altogether. The message West had failed. The betrayal was exposed. The regime's inner rot was now visible. Yet the end was still not fully here, and that made everything heavier, because the final days of the Reich would now unfold with the mask torn off, the loyalty broken, and the men closest to power left staring into the ruins they had made, knowing the last chapter was coming, and knowing there was no clean way out of it.
April 30th, 1945 did not bring resolution so much as release. Hitler was dead in Berlin, but the violence he had set loose did not vanish with him. Across Germany, commands were still moving through broken channels. Men who had spent years speaking in orders now faced a world where their uniforms no longer guaranteed power, only recognition and guilt. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz tried to hold together a government in the north for a few more days, hoping to surrender as many German forces as possible to the British and Americans, rather than the Soviets. That choice alone showed how the final thinking inside the ruined Reich still worked. Even after everything, even after the camps, the executions, the cities burned down to stone and ash, the people closest to power were still calculating where death might be more useful, where capture might be more bearable, where survival might still be arranged. The separate deal Himmler had reached through Bernadotte was gone, but the instinct behind it remained alive right to the end. Europe was closing over the Third Reich, and still its last officials were trying to shape the terms of the grave. Bernadotte moved through those same days for a very different reason. The rescue work tied to the White Bus's operation had pulled thousands out of camps and prison sites during the last stretch of the war. Some were Scandinavians at first, then many others as the mission widened. It was dangerous work, improvised work, and often morally tangled because it required dealing with murderers who still controlled the roads, the paperwork, and the bodies of the imprisoned. That is part of what gives this story its bitter shape. In the same collapsing landscape, one man was trying to salvage human lives, while another was trying to salvage political leverage.
History sometimes gets drawn to the dramatic secret in the middle and forgets the people whose lives hung on each convoy, each clearance, each hour gained before the system broke completely. Bernadotte's place in this story should never be confused with Himmler's purpose. He was not carrying hope for the Reich. He was moving through its ruins while trying to pull people out before the last doors slammed shut. The harder truth is that these two paths crossed because the world was so broken that rescue and deception had to move through the same corridors. That is why the story feels so eerie. A humanitarian mission became the road by which one of the darkest men in Nazi Germany tried to reach the West. When people hear about the Bernadotte mission, some still imagine a hidden peace attempt from Hitler himself, a final secret gesture from the top, as if the dictatorship looked into the abyss and blinked. But that version gives the moment too much dignity. Hitler did not send out a sincere last offer to stop the bloodshed. Himmler acted on his own, and he acted when defeat was already beyond argument. He had seen the military truth more clearly than Hitler did, or at least admitted it sooner to himself. Yet even then he was not moved by remorse. He was trying to preserve part of Germany's armed strength in the West, keep the Soviets under fire, and possibly leave himself a role in whatever came next. That difference changes everything. One version suggests a final turn toward reality. The other reveals a man stepping away from doomed loyalty because loyalty had become useless. The mission was secret, but it was not noble. It was a symptom of the collapse. It exposed the point where the discipline of the regime gave way to self-preservation. For years, Himmler had helped create the image of a system that never bent, never doubted, never broke. In April 1945, he helped destroy that image himself.
What happened after only made that clearer. Cast out by Hitler and stripped of office, Himmler tried to disappear into the chaos under a false identity after Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. He did not walk into history as a statesman who had tried to end the war. He moved like a hunted man in a defeated country, one more senior Nazi trying to outrun the meaning of his own record. British forces captured him near Bremerford in late May. Soon after, on May 23, 1945, he killed himself with cyanide while in British custody. That ending was grim, but it was also fitting, coldly. He had spent years helping run a system built on fear, secrecy, and death. In the end, secrecy failed him, fear consumed him, and death was the last thing he still controlled. There was no separate peace, no late redemption, no clever escape from history. There was only exposure, collapse, and the final proof that a man who had helped organize vast crimes could not negotiate his way out of the world he had helped create. That is why this story reaches beyond one meeting near Lübeck, beyond one message, beyond even the last days of Hitler's rule. It says something larger about power when power begins to fail. People often imagine that the end of a brutal regime must bring clarity, that the guilty will suddenly see what they have done, that truth will break through the lies in one clean burst. Real history is harsher. Systems built on terror usually do not end with moral awakening. They end with fracture, denial, bargaining, and men trying to save fragments of themselves from the wreckage. The Bernadotte mission shows that with unusual precision. On the surface, it looks like a diplomatic curiosity from the final week of the war. Underneath, it is one of the sharpest glimpses into how the Nazi state died from the inside. Public loyalty remained in speeches. Private betrayal had already begun. Grand ideology still appeared in slogans. Personal fear was now making decisions. That is one reason this story still lingers. It forces us to look at the difference between image and truth. Nazi Germany liked to present itself as a machine of discipline. Its last week showed something much more human and much more rotten. Vanity, fear, calculation, and men quietly stepping away from the ruin they had helped build. There is also a harder lesson in the way Bernadotte's role fits into all this. Some of the most important work in history gets done without clean surroundings. Rescue does not always happen far from evil. Sometimes it has to pass through evil, negotiate with it, use the few openings left by collapsing systems, and keep moving anyway. That does not make the evil smaller.
It makes the rescue braver. Bernadotte's mission existed in a world where innocence had almost no room left to operate, and still lives were saved. That matters because when the story narrows too much around Himmler's maneuver, we lose sight of the people who were still being carried out of camps while powerful men at the top plotted their own survival. Those lives are part of the truth too. They remind us that even in the final darkness, history was not made only by those trying to preserve power.
It was also made by those trying to preserve human beings. In the end, what remains is simpler and heavier than the myth. There was no last hidden peace offer from Hitler. There was a desperate approach from Himmler, sent through a Swedish count whose real work was rescue, and it failed because it deserved to fail. The Reich did not die reaching for peace. It died reaching for an advantage one last time. That may be the most haunting part of all. Even with Berlin collapsing, even with the war clearly lost, even with the world already counting the dead, the instinct inside that system was still to maneuver, divide, and survive. It could no longer win, yet it still could not tell the truth. So the final image this story leaves behind is not one of reconciliation. It is of a collapsing empire showing its real face at last. A leadership talking of surrender while still thinking in terms of use. A state built on obedience cracking into private betrayals, and a man who helped rule by terror ending as a fugitive with poison hidden on his body. Some endings arrive with a speech. This one arrived with whispers, ruined roads, rescue convoys, broken loyalties, and men who had commanded death discovering that history had finally stopped listening. If you want to see what happened to Himmler after, watch this next video titled What Happened to Himmler After Hitler Branded Him a Traitor. Please, if this story meant something to you, subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and come back for more, because stories like this deserve to be remembered.